Hello, let's do the fifth video in atomic structure 1.5 elements and compounds. Now we've learnt what an element is. Element is something that can't be broken down because each atom is unique for each element, and so you can't break it down into smaller parts in terms of physical science, in terms of chemistry. And so an element is a substance that cannot be broken down into simpler substances because it is made up of only one type of atom. Elements can be grouped according to their physical and chemical properties as either metals or non-metals. And so that's the first classification we have of elements, and that is as metals or non-metals. And we can do that through the periodic table, very simple way of doing it. And when we get to the periodic table, I'll tell you about that. Basically, the left hand side of the periodic table as you look at it are metals, and the right hand side of the periodic table are non-metals, and there's a line that distinguishes between the two. Now a group of atoms may join together to form a molecule. Classic example that we might use is just water, H2O, where you have three atoms joining together, two hydrogens and an oxygen, and then we call that a molecule. A substance that can be broken down or decomposed into its elements by chemical reactions is called a compound. So it would have a chemical formula, and to break it apart we need to do a chemical process. Now that is different from a mixture, which we'll talk about later. And so water, for example, is a chemical compound because to break the hydrogen and oxygens apart you've got to do some special things to it. Now, properties of a compound are very different from those of the elements that make them up. And that's very important to realize, that you just can't assume that something has a certain element in it. It has the same properties as that element by itself. Now, some example, or a typical example, is hydrogen gas, which has the formula H2, burns in oxygen quite explosively, and oxygen, O2, is an oxygen that we breathe in and don't have any problems with. And if we have two lots, two containers, one containing hydrogen molecules and one containing oxygen molecules, and if we have it in the right ratio, we can mix those together and they won't mix together. The oxygen molecules, here's an example, two oxygens joined together, and there's another example, two hydrogens joined together and another oxygen. They'll happily sit like that. But if we add a spark, we get an explosion, a quite energetic explosion, and these molecules all split apart and reform into water molecules, and that's a chemical compound, and this is the chemical process that's happening. Alright, so that just tells us the formula for water, H2O. Now a mixture is formed when two or more pure substances are combined without them reacting chemically with each other. Now a mixture, to separate it, we generally separate it physically, and it's generally easy to separate, although some examples you might think that's quite hard to separate, but we can still separate them. For example, sand and salt form a mixture that can be separated readily by physical means. And how would you separate salt and sand, I might ask you? Any ideas? Well, what about mixing the salt and sand in water? Give it a bit of a stir. The salt will dissolve in the water, the sand won't. You could pour off the salty water, that way you get the sand. Now if you want to reclaim the salt, all you would have to do is evaporate the water, and the water would evaporate off. You'd be left with salt crystals in your container, and you'd be able to separate them. Bit of work, but you'd be able to do it. Now here's our classification scheme for matter. We can have a mixture or a pure substance. Mixture is physically separated. Now of a pure substance we can have a definite compositions, so we have an element, any of the elements on the periodic table, or a compound, any mixtures of the elements on the periodic table, and then you can chemically separate them. So we'll be using that classification in a prac that we do. And you'll also be doing this question here, classifying them as an element, compound or mixture. There's the answers, and in the next video we'll learn a little bit about the periodic table. Bye!